Hi, everyone. I'm Rosemarie Miller here with Jemima McEvoy, a wealth reporter here at Forbes, here to tell us about the biggest philanthropist we have never heard of. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jemima.
Of course, happy to be here.
So, Jemima, who is this philanthropist?
Yes, so the philanthropist, her name is Elisabeth DeLuca. You probably know her based on the company that, made her money, her fortune, and that's Subway sandwiches. She's the widow of one of the co-founders of Subway, Fred DeLuca, the other co-founder, Peter Buck. Both of them have passed away. And based on our reporting, we found out that she inherited his half of the Subway sandwich chain when he died in 2015 from cancer. She now has a fortune estimated at $8.2 billion, and she is one of the richest people in the world. The reason that we say that, she's one of the biggest philanthropists you probably never heard of is despite, being attached to the household name of Subway, she's kept an incredibly low profile. She owns, a $1.2 million condo in Palm Beach in an apartment building. She doesn't seem to have, big flashy things. She doesn't make public appearances very often, at least that we could find. And she's kept an incredibly low profile to the point that some, Subway franchisees didn't even know who the owner was after Fred DeLuca died. But over the past few years, since her late husband's death, she's been giving away a lot of money into two family foundations and been making some very big philanthropic gifts. She's channeled over $700 million of their fortune into these charities, and she has also given away a lot of land for conservation. So she's a pretty significant philanthropist, and it looks like she might be on the verge of donating a lot more money. In August, she and Subway's other founding family, the Bucks, agreed to sell the sandwich chain to Roark Capital, a private equity group that owns Arby's and Dunkin' Donuts, and that's a $9.7 billion deal. So we calculated after tax that Elisabeth and her family will walk away with at least $3.2 billion in cash after the deal. So she's about to come into a lot of cash, and based on, the trends that we've seen in her philanthropy, it looks like she might be, about to give a lot more money away.
So is this like her own way of forging her philanthropic legacy separate from Subway and her late husband?
So we don't know her motivations or anything. She didn't speak to us for the article. Her lawyers and representatives didn't respond to requests for comment. But it does, she is forging her own legacy. That's a fact. She's a well-respected philanthropist in Florida and in Connecticut, where she's been giving away a lot of money over the past few years, mostly to educational causes. And a lot of that seems linked back to her background. So we did the research that we could to figure out as much as we could about, her experience growing up and who she is. And, her family immigrated from East Prussia, which became a battleground during World War II. It's a former German province that was invaded by the Soviet Red Army during the Second World War, and a lot of people were killed, and it became a very dangerous place to live. And when she was about 7 years old, her family immigrated to the U.S., and they eventually landed in Connecticut, where she went to high school, and she met Fred. They were high school sweethearts and got married when she was just a teenager, maybe in her early 20s. It's unclear exactly how old she was, but very young. And she worked as a nurse at a local hospital while he started the sandwich chain. And then she eventually gave up on nursing and started working for Subway, writing operation manuals. And throughout, his career, he was very much in the limelight. He was the spokesperson for Subway. He was, this big, larger-than-life character. And she faded, into the background. She didn't have a prominent role at the company. So this is a long-winded way of saying, she's forging her own legacy, separate from her late husband's now, it seems like.
So speaking of her late husband, didn't he have some legal battles going on in Florida?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest and most interesting, in my opinion, things that she's done is in late 2020, she gave away 27,000 acres of land in Florida to the University of Florida. And so her late husband bought this land in 2005 for $140 million with a business partner who was a local real estate developer called Anthony Pugliese. And together they had this kind of wild plan to build this community called Destiny. So this was just like bare land that they bought, and they wanted to build a city, an eco-friendly city, that could house like 250,000 people or more. And it was a very ambitious plan, and it fell apart pretty quickly. By 2009, Anthony Pugliese and Fred DeLuca were in court, each accusing each other of various things. It was eventually found out that Pugliese had been stealing money from DeLuca. He'd been like setting up fake accounts and overcharging him. So DeLuca won. Pugliese ended up in prison for a few months. But this failed, real estate development project was important because it was actually on land that was very important from a conservation perspective. So in Florida, there's this thing called it's a land corridor, which is like basically a patchwork of super important conservation land in Florida that houses some of the state's most important and endangered animals and plants, which includes the grasshopper sparrow, which there's only a few hundred of those birds left in the U.S., and they reside specifically in this area in Florida and nowhere else. And so when Anthony Pugliese and Fred DeLuca bought this land, local conservationists were very upset and shocked because they had been trying to buy the land themselves to conserve it, and to see that it was going to be built, the city would be built on it, and all these animals and plants and stuff would die. Everybody was very concerned in the conservation community. So what Elisabeth DeLuca did was the year after this project, the lawsuits were concluded and Fred won. He had died by that point, but by that point, she decided to give away the land to the University of Florida, and she put it under a conservation easement, which means that it can never be developed. So now it's being used by students at the University of Florida to research, these animals and these species and different Florida-related wildlife and agriculture topics. So it's a pretty cool donation, and that's another thing that's, helping her forge her own legacy is, giving away this thing that her husband had a whole different vision for. So it's a pretty interesting donation.
So she's also giving to another school, right? University of Connecticut. Could you talk about that donation?
Yeah, so that's the first big thing we've seen her do since she signed the subway deal in August. That deal doesn't seem to have gone through yet, at least it hasn't been announced, as in like the closing of the subway deal, so it doesn't seem like she's gotten that cash yet. But in October, 6 weeks after the announcement came about the subway sale, she donated $40 million to the University of Connecticut, where she got her nursing degree. And they're going to use that money to build a new nursing school facility. And it's the biggest donation in the school's history. So it's another, nod to the past for her. And, she was a nurse for a few years, and she actually was the head nurse in a surgical intensive care unit at a local hospital. So that's a pretty big job. And she gave $40 million to her alma mater. So it seems like we're beginning to learn the most that we can about her through her philanthropy. Just because she's so private, you get these like little, looks into her life, which is interesting.
So how does her philanthropic style compare to other notable women philanthropists?
Yeah, so in my story, I point out that she's kind of part of a new wave of female philanthropists that are quietly, like in an understated way, giving away their fortunes. She, doesn't do a lot of press. She doesn't do any interviews, actually. She doesn't talk about her donations really, except in like a couple of small things she's done. But it's kind of similar to Mackenzie Scott, the wife or the former wife of Jeff Bezos, who has given away $14.4 billion at least since she inherited a 4% stake in Amazon when she and Jeff divorced in 2019. And she's been pretty private about that too, although she did start publishing some information on a website. And then, Laureen Powell-Jobs is another one who's given away, she's pledged $3.5 billion to climate-related causes. So we kind of are putting we're grouping them in a similar way in the style of the way they're doing their philanthropy and, the speed at which, after inheriting their fortunes, they're giving it away. And Elisabeth DeLuca, she's poured $700 million into her charity. She's given away $140 million worth of land on top of that. And she's about to come into a bunch of money. So we think that this could be, a pattern that's going to begin to speed up.
Well, Jemima, you were certainly right. She was the biggest philanthropist I had never heard of, but now I have a better idea of who she is.
There you go.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.